Welcome to On the Table with Ashley. This is our food and connection series that explores the many ways people create connection through food. From community gardens and classrooms to dinner tables across the world, the series highlights stories of gathering nourishment, memory, and care. Through insightful conversations with experts from all walks of life, the vulnerable conversations shared over dinner, the scents and recipes that carry memories of home, and the grassroots efforts communities make to combat food insecurity and support one another. Through these conversations, we examine how food unites people, preserves culture, conjures memory, and creates identities. Ultimately, the series reveals the profound role food plays in nearly every human experience. Our guest today is Professor Thurka Sangaramoorthy. Professor Sangaramoorthy is a cultural and medical anthropologist and a political health researcher with 22 years of experience conducting research among vulnerable populations in the United States, Africa, and Latin America. Dr. Sangaramoorthy is a professor and chair of the Department of Anthropology at American University. Thurka is an author of the books Treating AIDS, Rapid Ethnographic Assessments, and Landscapes of Care. Enjoy.
Professor Sangaramoorthy, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm thrilled to talk to you about your career and how your career has taken a personal twist in some family historian work you've been doing lately.
Thank you so much for having me. This is the first time I've done a podcast on food, so I really appreciate the chance to talk about food and my family.
I always like to start hearing a little bit about what kind of kid you were and where you grew up.
Sure. So I grew up in two very different environments. I was born in Sri Lanka in the north, in Jaffna. And I was born into a civil war, essentially. It was highly militarized at the time. And then my family, one by one, my maternal family and my paternal family, and many Sri Lankan Tamils from the north in particular left due to the escalation of violence and then eventually a civil war that lasted 5 decades. So I grew up in two different environments. So in Sri Lanka, what kind of a kid was I? I was super extroverted, very much a tomboy, loved to be out and about, had a great family network, friend network. I don't have a lot of particular memories. I was really young when I came here. And we settled in Rochester, New York, of all places. Very cold, really cold. We actually came in the fall. And Rochester is known for some really heavy winters and cold weathers. That was completely new to me. A lot of things were new, like escalators, elevators. The language, I knew English, but it was very British English. I was in first or second grade when I started here and started school right away. I pretty much became fluent in English in probably 2 weeks. Kind of have most kids, I think, essentially have to have that, especially when you're living in an environment that's not very diverse and many people often don't speak anything other than English. So I think here I had a really strong family network. My maternal family is all here, the ones that I write about. So it was a very close-knit community. I think I was a little bit quieter, had to kind of figure out who I was, why I looked different, why my family was different, and we didn't have a lot of money. So that was also really sort of, I think, complicated and complex for a child. So I was a little bit quieter. I loved reading. So a lot more sort of internal movement, I think. I think someone who was very curious about my peers, got along well with others. Yeah, just a little bit quieter once I moved here.
So it's super interesting how different your childhood experience was. And it makes a lot of sense because of the upheaval, trauma, migration, all of this. And now you are a global and medical anthropologist and a health expert. I have to believe that your professional path is related to your personal history. Can you just tell us a little bit about that and how you ended up on this career path?
So I think you're absolutely right. There's very few differences, I think, in terms of the professional and personal. Now, as an academic, I can tell you that many scholars of color very much do research and teach on the very circumstances that they've have been influenced by and what's really impacted their life, to also help others understand some of the challenges and yet also some of the joys of various different kind of communities. I think it's not a deficit model, right? Absolutely. And we need to understand that. But these are also communities of extraordinary joy, extraordinary strength, extraordinary ways of understanding the world. And I think that's also really important to me, to be able to tell those stories, not necessarily to translate or to amplify, but just to help others understand some of these issues, but also some of the strengths that these communities actually have, and why it's so important to understand how communities think, why they do what they do. And in my field, really think about how health is not just a clinic or biomedical terms, but also a wealth of other kinds of ways that people understand their bodies and their lives. I'm an anthropologist and an epidemiologist. I'm dually trained, and it's really interesting because so many immigrant communities, for many of them, it's really to become sort of a professional, right? In a sense, like it's not necessarily to become a writer or an artist per se, but rather a particular kind of professional. And I was definitely one of those kids that it was assumed that I would do medicine. And I think I was really curious about things. This came out of really enjoying science, but also being in situations where I did have to translate not just language, but just how, what doctors were saying, what healthcare professionals were saying to my family, and to be around others that also really struggled to understand certain things. So it's not that I wasn't against becoming a physician, but when I got to college, I'm a first generation college student. When I got to college, I went to a liberal arts school. And so therefore I had to take some core classes. The ones that I wanted to take were filled. And so I took the one that was open, it was called Perceptions of the Alien. That was the title of the course. And I thought, okay, whatever, it might be fun to learn about extraterrestrial life. And I took it and in walked an anthropologist. And it was the alien as the other. So what being othered means in society, what differences mean, why we think this way. I felt it was transformative. It was shockingly transformative in a sense. I'd never heard of anthropology before, but it was essentially, I was taking a course about my life and was really interested in what anthropologists did, how they did things, and really just understanding this notion around culture and societies. And I was really hooked. And so I kept my love of science and biology, but also did anthropology. When I graduated, like many college kids, I didn't really know what I wanted to do, but I knew I didn't want to go to medical school. And my first job out of college was for a think tank. I worked for the Africa program. This was in the late 90s, early 2000s. And I traveled quite a bit to Africa to do this work. And at that time, I really saw firsthand the devastating impact of HIV and AIDS. And in Africa, it was really stunning, and how different it was and how much devastation and impact that it had on everyone's lives. I thought I wanted to do something that could get me out to the field in a much quicker time frame. And so I chose public health. I really loved it. But there was also this discomfort with knowing that what I was studying and how I wanted to help people really didn't take into context people's societies or their environments or the structural sort of constraints that people were living with. And so I went back to get my PhD in anthropology. And so I've really maintained this dual nature of working in public and global health alongside a lot of my work in anthropology as well. So that's a little bit about how I got to where I am.
I love the Perceptions of the Alien course, and I feel like So often I hear about these sliding door moments in people's lives. And what if you hadn't taken that course? It's, your whole life might have been different. Or maybe not, but it makes me think about it.
I have a lot of students who take a lot of my classes that I teach around health and anthropology are the very same courses. They're the core courses that you have to take no matter what major you're in to kind of get those credits to graduate. And so my philosophy has always been I'm not trying to convert you into majoring in anthropology. It's just that if you took this one course and it still lives and helps you along the way, it gives you that sensibility of really looking at and just being curious about people in general.
Right. And I have a son who just finished his first year of college and then one who's a senior in high school. And I'm thinking, I think it's really great to take an anthropology course as an undergrad. I mean, just for the experience of it, even if you don't want that to be your major or your profession. So I want to talk about this. I don't know how you describe it, like a food historian project that centers around your family following your uncle's death during the COVID times. So I want to hear about that project. I do want to just give a tiny little background, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. So this is what I've researched, that Tamil is one of the longest surviving languages with over 2,000 years of written history. Sri Lanka, where you were born, gained independence in 1948 after colonial rule ended, and ethnic tension arose with the Sinhalese, who constituted a majority and inflicted linguistic, cultural, and economic discrimination on the Tamil minority through government action, as well as pogroms, and ultimately the Sri Lankan Civil War, which you were born during, it sounds like.
Yeah.
So I think it's just important for people to have a little bit of foundational history for your story. And there were so many Sri Lankan Tamils who were displaced during and before the Civil War. But in terms of just giving a little bit of narrative around sort of your story, if there's anything you want to add to that or edit, please do.
I think the only additions that I would have is that Sri Lanka has a really rich history throughout times. It has been colonized by multiple different countries, including the Portuguese. It has a huge Portuguese influence. The British are the formally colonized Sri Lanka for a very long time. And during that time, Sinhalese and Tamils have been living on the island for a long time together and in various different phases of conflict. They are ethno-linguistically different. They are also religiously different. And so there are these differences, but they've survived on this small island for a very long time before the British came. And when the British came, there were definitely ways that the Tamils benefited during colonialism, even though we were not the majority. And when independence happened, there was a reshifting of power and a lot of sort of animosity. And there were essentially civil wars. There's a dynamic there that I think very few people understand unless you've actually gone through it, where your best friends, your neighbors can turn on you. And that is, as someone who works with Haitian communities, for instance, these are very intimate, familiar levels of violence that I think really require more sustained thought around what that does to communities. Again, those that have been living side by side for centuries, and then all of a sudden, it's really difficult to rebuild that, regardless of whenever the war actually ends officially.
Well, let's talk about the food project.
Great.
So tell us how it came to life and what you've done and what you've learned.
So as an academic, as in any profession, at least with academics, when you get tenure and when you reach a certain stage in your career, you're not necessarily evaluated for, it's not the same level of evaluation, meaning there are subject matter where you're considered an expert and you become really good at what you do. when you gain tenure, and in my case, when I was promoted, so there are two stages of an academic's career. First is tenure and mid-career, and then later in your career, you get fully promoted. And with that, what that means is that there's a little bit of freedom to pursue things that you're really passionate about that may not have counted in the same way for career promotion. So studying your own family, for instance, may not have been thought of as very rigorous or scientific, right? But at this stage of my career, if you had asked me, could I have done this earlier on? Most likely not, no. So I think that's an important part of being able to tell this story too, is that there are structural constraints that I was no longer feeling to be able to do this. And so this is something, as an undergraduate so long ago, I actually interviewed my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, for a project in anthropology and learned about her story. It was not on food, but it was about her migration story and her transition into the US. So this is something that I'm really trained in. I know how to interview people. I know how to elicit life stories. But I had always wanted to do this for my own family. Like many immigrant families, I grew up in this very kind of closed environment. My mom is one of 9 children. I essentially had 9 sets of parents growing up, which is there was a lot of pressure. There was a lot of, I didn't have a lot of friends. I didn't need them because I had so many cousins. Now, all of us over time, which I think many Americans will understand, we disperse as we get older, and we're in various different parts of the country. And so my mom and her siblings are still incredibly part of this network of siblings. Many of them are still in Rochester, New York, where I grew up. Many of them are not, but they're really close. And so I wanted to kind of, as they were getting older, I wanted to kind of start capturing some of this, but I just never had time. And I thought it just seemed overwhelming. I wasn't really interested in sort of understanding their history of transition to the US, and they had various different ways. Not everyone came directly from Sri Lanka to here. There were multiple stops. And so I was really curious always about that and trying to capture stories, but I didn't also just want to ask these questions because I wasn't sure how much they would share with me if I had asked them direct questions. And then I think over time, as I got older, had my own children, as they were growing up, I thought about food is a huge central part of my life and my family's life. And I also didn't really know some of these recipes. They're not really recipes. People just cook. And if you ask them what they're putting in, they really couldn't tell you. One example, I have a really favorite curry. It's a jackfruit. My grandmother didn't cook jackfruit. She cooked the seeds of the jackfruit in a curry. And I love that curry. And yet no one in my mom's generation can actually recreate it. And I don't know how to make it. And so, this is one example, right? They're excellent cooks. They're amazing cooks. And I didn't want to lose some of those practices or anything like that. And I didn't really know what kinds of ingredients that we're using. So as I thought more and more about it, I began to kind of think about how I could use food as an entry point to actually ask the questions that I was really interested in, but also kind of capture some of the things that I thought I was losing myself, or my children definitely would have lost. And my eldest uncle, my mom's eldest brother, passed away during COVID. I was living overseas at that time, and I had a couple of dreams about him. And during one of the times that I was back in the US, I went to go see him. I wasn't all that close to him, and I didn't really see him often, but something told me I needed to go see him, and I did, and he passed away right after. And so for me, I thought, okay, this is sort of like some sort of a calling that I need to do this now. And so I started this project. I talked to all of them. They were really excited about the food part. And that's how I sort of prefaced it, really, is that I wanted to kind of really understand their favorite foods, like what they cooked. And I think it's really interesting for me, another piece of it that was unintended is that I think they no longer see me as like a 10 or 15-year-old.
Finally.
Finally. And I think after this, some of them opened up, and I heard a lot about family dynamics that I don't think that I was quite aware of, or I knew a little bit about, but not really the depth of it. And I think now, it's a way for them to actually be really proud of the things that they are really interested in cooking and what their hopes and dreams are around passing this down. I don't think that anyone's really asked them these questions, right? And so I think that's also something, there's just a genuine curiosity about their lives that I think that they appreciate. So yes, it is sort of an accidental historian. And I think I'm really thankful not only for this project, but it's also given me a chance to reconnect with my aunts and uncles that I had sort of a tenuous relationship with as a child in a different way.
And so did you record all of these discussions?
I did. I recorded all of them. So I have the audio. I also did something different, which is that I usually work in contexts where I can't record because things are really sensitive, and I interview a lot of people who don't want to be recorded or on record. And so I've gotten really good at that, but this I really wanted to record, and I think many people were okay recording things, except for one aunt who didn't want to be recorded. The interview part, she didn't want to be recorded, but she did the recording of the when we cooked. I also did a lot of visual media, meaning I had a little bit of help videotaping and also doing photography. I'm not a photographer, but doing some shots in the kitchen, for instance.
You published an article, and we'll put that in the show notes so people can see some of those pictures, which are in your article. And then are you writing a book about this?
So I didn't want this to be academic at all.
Okay.
To me, I'm not a food scholar, right? I can talk about traditions and remembering and migration. I do have expertise in migration, but I wanted to do something that was a little bit less academic. So if there was a chance to actually do a kind of a cookbook or something that wasn't a straight cookbook, but something that actually narrated people's lives along with the recipes that they thought were important to them.
Yeah.
In my mom's family, each of them growing up, their nicknames were like their favorite food. So I thought that might be a fun way to kind of organize the chapters. And so I kind of did little snippets for the article that you read. I have one more that I'm working on right now. Another idea that I had was around some sort of a sensory, like multi-sensorial project. I'm not sure quite what that would look like, but I'm hoping to play around and have a little bit more time to do this and to focus on it.
Okay, so let's talk about a couple things that I thought were really interesting. So one that you talk about in the article is cooking for men. So traditionally in Sri Lanka, men didn't cook. And maybe that's different today. I don't know. But you have a lovely description of these gender roles that, and I like to think about life as, and things like migration and all the trauma, there are silver linings. And one of the silver linings here, I think, is that men are cooking. Tamil men are cooking in the United States where they weren't cooking in Sri Lanka. And I'm just going to read this. This is from your article, and then maybe you can talk a little bit about your uncle, the one you talk about who loves to cook now. In Jaffna, Babu's father ruled with an iron fist, especially at mealtime. No one was allowed to eat until he sampled and finished his food. A stray pebble in the rice could send a plate flying into the yard. His mother cooked, his father judged. A strict gendering of roles that reflected broader Tamil patriarchal traditions that kept men out of the kitchen. Had Babu stayed, he might have inherited that dynamic, perpetuating the distance between male authority and the intimate labor of cooking. But displacement upended these gender norms. Like many Tamil men of his generation who were forced to leave home, like his younger brother Sadan, who learned to cook in his Indian boarding school, Babu learned to cook first for survival, then discovered it as a way to nurture others. This transformation wasn't just about acquiring new skills. It represented a fundamental shift in how Tamil men could express care and participate in family life. So can you tell us a little bit about Babu and cooking, and maybe it's an opportunity to touch on some of the positive things that come from migration,
Mhm.
even if it's either forced migration or migration as a result of war or violence or those
Mhm.
kinds of things.
So, absolutely. I grew up in a society, this is not universal, but I definitely grew up in a society and a community where men did not cook. Men were not expected to be even in the kitchen to even help with food preparation. But at the same time, I guess this was like the great irony of being a child. Every man that I knew cooked. They cooked and they loved cooking. And my father also does not come from this family, but my father, I don't know. And I think it maybe translates into something like he didn't even know how to boil water or make rice, which is a foundational dish, right? And my father's an excellent cook, and he only learned to cook when he came here. And I think it's not the same with my uncles, for instance. Many of them, so my uncle Babu, who first went off, he was a teacher at a boarding school. So he boarded with other men. It's single gender, and they had to cook. They didn't have someone, they didn't have a cook, they didn't have a maid, so they cooked themselves, and they just kind of through communication with their families just kind of cobbled together again, like for survival, right? They had to learn how to cook for themselves. Then he went to London as a student and now was in this completely different environment with various different kinds of ingredients. He also then found a Tamil community, a Sri Lankan Tamil community. He was in a boarding house as well, and there were single men. But here now you have something a little bit different where you're not in the same socioeconomic class anymore. You're really scraping to get by as a student. So you're looking for ingredients that mimic the taste of home, but you can't procure these things, right? Whether because they cost too much or you just there aren't grocery stores during that time that where you could get the same kinds of ingredients. So it's just a very different dynamic in which he cooked. When he came here now into the US, which was his trajectory, my aunt joined him, now my aunt, who was his fiance in London. And when they came here, traditional gender roles took over, right? So these are dynamics. In a sense, he cooked for himself, but then he did not cook for his family when they came here. And for the vast majority of his life in the US, he didn't cook. Now he's retired. He's been retired for a number of years and he cooks and he loves cooking and he loves cooking for his children. He loves cooking for his grandchildren. It's really something that brings him a lot of joy. He gardens, he grows his own vegetables now. I was just in Rochester and I always go see him because he loves to show his garden. So he takes a lot of pride in that and he loves cooking. And so I think these are not like things that hold steady. They move and they change over time depending on where you are in life, what your circumstances are, where you are located. And it's the same with all of my uncles. They are amazing cooks. They love to cook. There's a sheer joy in it. And I think one of the things that I think is really interesting is that the women are excellent cooks, but I don't know if there's real joy in it because they've had to cook. They've cooked since they were little girls. They had to be in the kitchen. They had to help my grandmother. And so food for them is nourishment, right? It's something that you need to have in order to sustain yourself. But for the men, I think it's really different, at least the men in my family, it's really different. There's a genuine sort of innovativeness, there's experimentation, there's trying different things out, there's pure joy in watching others eat, and real pride in being able to like feed your family, I think, or cook for your family. Out of the 9 children, my mom is right in the middle. So she has 2 older brothers, 2 younger brothers. She has 2 older sisters. She has 2 younger sisters, right? So she's right in the middle. And so there's also this age, or I don't know what to call it, like age birth order, whatever. But there are these older kids, including my mother, and then there are 4 younger kids. And food was really short. She did not grow up in a wealthy household. And I think the older children, again, I think at least the women, the 3 women, cook because they have to cook. I'm not saying they don't enjoy it, and no, I'm not saying that they don't enjoy feeding their families and watching everyone eat. And food is a huge central part of their lives. But there's just sort of a difference in how they approach food and cooking. Whereas the younger children, I don't think there was a lot of pressure in Sri Lanka for them to be in the kitchen or to help out. And I think they were cooked for. And so when they came here, they mimicked very much the similar things that I'm telling you about, like the innovation, the experimentation, the love of cooking, trying new things, putting things together. So it's not just like a gender thing. There's also this other generational sort of differences that I've also noticed if I had to pick out some of the themes that are coming out from this work.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I spoke with Ken Albala, who's a professor and food historian, as part of this series, and he writes cookbooks and other books on food, the history of food. And it's funny, he says he actually doesn't like cookbooks, even though he writes them, because he wants people to get back to this more intuitive way of cooking, which it sounds like is exactly what your family does, like a little of this, a little of that, which makes it hard to pass on to other generations unless you're like cooking together in the kitchen. But there is something beautiful about that way of cooking. But he also has this joy that you're talking about. So he cooks for himself literally every day. He experiments most at breakfast, but he's always cooking and always trying different things. And he just has this joy about him. And he's trying, I think, to remind us what a joy it is to cook and feed others. And it is super interesting. I think that if we studied it, we would find the same thing in the United States, with women often feeling like they had to cook. I think things today are different because there's so much takeout. I think what Ken is suggesting, and I agree, is like, to the extent we can, we should get back to cooking as much as we can ourselves, because I think it brings more joy, and you're closer to the food, and you're also much more cognizant of waste and other things if you're using the ingredients and cooking yourself, and it's also healthier. There are so many reasons, but one of them, and I'm trying to I cook a lot, and I'm trying to bring this back into my own life, is like, it's a privilege and a joy to cook instead of a burden to cook. And I completely understand, like you talked about times in life, and I completely believe there are seasons in life. There were times in my life when I was working so many hours, I literally couldn't put dinner on the table every day if I didn't have help or takeout or whatever. But now I am cooking a lot, and I'm really trying to be like present in that cooking and like find the joy in it. And there is a lot of joy when you make something that people like. But I think it's a really important point, and one that bears, frankly, more study and discussion about the gendered roles of cooking, and why perhaps men who come to cooking have more joy in it overall.
I just thought of something that I hadn't really thought about too, is that I keep saying they had to cook. I think women in my family and in so many other families, they were judged by their cooking, right? Their worth as people, as women, as wives, as mothers, right, was judged on their cooking, how they cooked. I mean, there was so much pressure. One of my aunts, right, she went to go live with her in-laws, and there was so much judgment, even though she was just essentially a child, so much judgment on her fit as a wife and as like a continuation, right? Her worthiness was so tied up in her cooking. I think my mom also is very much in this kind of corner. They're beautiful cooks, but there's a regimented sort of way of where I witness how they cook that I don't see in the first 3 women in my mom's family, her and her 2 older sisters. My oldest aunt actually talks about it. I mean, they all talk about it. You know, she wanted to study. She didn't really want to cook, but she was the one where she wanted to kind of like study or read. She was sent out to the market to buy the vegetables, and she really resented that. So there's a lot of emotion that is really tied up in this, that for generations, right, even as they became mothers, it was really hard. My mom worked full time. I rarely ever saw her. And that's when my dad started cooking, and I had my grandmother's cooking quite a bit during that time. But my mom still had to do the shopping. She still had to cook. And so there's this very regimented kind of nature about it that doesn't, I'm not saying there's no joy. There's absolute joy. But in my family, it's really how you're known. You're known through your cooking. Like, people will say, like, she's an amazing cook before they say anything else about you. And so I don't ever remember anyone saying that about any of my uncles. I mean, they comment on it as an extra thing, but
Right.
that's not how they're judged, and their worthiness as people are not judged in this way. So I can definitely see that. I think another important thing about stages in life is also, I'm really curious about this in a sense of the other aspect is when you age, what happens with your cooking? That you can't use certain kinds of ingredients, given some of the health concerns, how you have to adapt to those. There are various different uncles and aunts that don't use the same ingredients anymore, or their spice level has to come down. So I think just, I study aging and health, but I think the aging in food and cooking is also just really fascinating.
Yeah. Well, you also write about Kala and how she cooks with fruits that remind her of home, while also intentionally introducing those flavors to her children. Can you talk about why it's important to introduce these flavors from home and maybe the recipes, but you talked earlier about sort of the taste of home, and maybe particularly when we migrate, it's a way we bring what was home with us. And I can see how that would be important to pass down through the generations, but I'd love for you to talk about that. And then also when it gets to your kids, so like another generation, and is it being preserved, or are you worried it's getting lost?
So much of the emphasis from everyone, regardless of whether it was my uncle or my aunts, there was so much focus on, not on cooking, but about getting a degree, doing well, etc. So like we didn't have the same kinds of, we were held to other kind of very similar restrictions, but I never felt any pressure to learn how to cook. I think Sri Lankan Tamils, again, I was talking a little bit about how different our food heritage is from Indian Tamils, even though we share the same religion often and similar language. Seafood is a huge part of Sri Lankan cuisine. The curries are different, meaning the spices that make up a curry are really different. It's often spicier. It has multiple different kinds of ingredients within it that are very different. Whereas Indian Tamil cooking, again, I'm generalizing here, is very much around vegetarian food, where we do eat goat and mutton. There is a lot of seafood, like I said. It's really different. It has a little bit of a Portuguese influence as well. Sri Lankan Tamils are really incredibly proud, and I would say insistent on the differences, right? Our food is not like Indian food, although to many people it might look like Indian food. It might taste like Indian food, except for some of the spice levels. There are specific kinds of ingredients that have really come about. Us being on the island, our shared histories with Sinhalese people and their food heritages. And so that's also, I think, a real source of pride and something that people don't want to lose, that distinction. I think for my cousins of my generation, since we grew up eating mostly home-cooked Sri Lankan Tamil food, it is a huge part of our lives, even though many of us probably couldn't recreate them or cook them without a lot of help and a lot of perseverance. Now, for our children, if they are not interacting with their grandparents, which most of them are, there's very little in the way of them eating this food. We're not cooking it regularly. So these are real treats. And my older son, who's in boarding school, I can tell you, like, both of my kids love spices. They love particular foods that are very Sri Lankan Tamil food. But I was just with my parents recently, And my older son, they had just cooked mutton curry for him because he's a big meat eater. And my son had to put yogurt in it because it was so spicy for him. And this is, again, as he said, look, I'm in boarding school. Like, the spice level is almost non-existent. So it's not that I could probably get used to this over time. But I think also for our children, like I'm talking about my generation and their children, all of us, most of us have children now. I think part of the issue is that they don't eat it regularly enough. So it is really hard. They also don't eat with their hands, many of them. So that's also different. It's really different when you eat with your hands. Like, I think it gives it a different taste and texture. We used to eat the same foods almost on a daily basis. The curry might change. So it could be like a kale curry versus like a cucumber curry, right? Or zucchini curry. But for them, having a vegetable curry and having a meat curry gets really old really fast. So in this way of being completely Americanized, they need to have this like variety that for us, it doesn't really exist. My oldest son definitely cooks, but it's just really different. I live in DC. There are no Sri Lankan restaurants here. Just Sri Lankan in general, right? Like not Tamil or Sinhalese, but just Sri Lankan restaurants. There used to be one. There is not one anymore in the DMV area. There are grocery stores that will cater, but there are really particular kinds of things that you really can't get at an Indian restaurant.
And do you have any hopes for your children, and not just your children, but your cousin's children, and for that generation to hold on to the Sri Lankan Tamil cooking or spices, or even if it's a little bit of it, like it's not going to be everything you had?
I think many of us, my generation, like I think there's a blandness that comes with other forms of cuisine. And so I think most of us are still very much, our taste levels and our spice levels are very much in tune with how we grew up. For my children, I think the variety is really important. The spice levels are probably not as high, but it is something that they do enjoy when they are around their grandparents or when I cook. Like I do have the same ingredients, but it never really tastes like what my parents make, right? Or what my aunts and uncles make. I do think there's a longing for folks of my cousins to hold on to some of this because this is what really reminds them of their parents and our time together growing up. So I do think these are important things. I think it just, it brings my parents joy when they eat this food, when their grandchildren eat this food. And I'm really hoping at some point I can also teach them how to cook some of this, or they can teach them how to cook, because I don't know if I really have a good handle on it either. I can cook basic things, but I could follow the exact same recipe that my mom does. It doesn't come out the same. And I think that's what's different about like the notion of a recipe, right? Like I cook it the same way. Like I could just be cooking with her. It wouldn't turn out the same way.
But I do love the idea of hopefully your cookbook, and maybe you have some of the videos of the cooking. And so there will be that history, because I often think for our kids, it's when they get a little bit older that they want that. So we want to preserve it for them for when they're ready for it too.
I totally agree. I mean, I take myself, like I'm a consumer of this food. I wasn't necessarily a producer of this food. And so I think just being so interested in not having some of this be lost was definitely something that I didn't experience until I was much older. So I do think that is very true.
Okay, I know you're working on a publication centered around mushroom curry, which is a dish that your uncle made. Can you tell us about that project and why it's important?
Yeah. So in anthropology, for instance, we're still in this disciplinary way, very much interested in understanding collective thought, right? There are very few places in anthropology even where you get one person's story that then tells you about an entire society or culture or specific situation. But I think that it's my co-author who's also my research manager, and so she's also a professional photographer. Actually, she thought that this particular dish was so profound in the way that it could tell this story about food, but also about migration and displacement and trauma. And I hadn't really thought of it that way. We don't really grow up eating mushroom curry. Like it wasn't anything that was that was really for me. It's not like my favorite thing, right? Like it's not the first thing that I think of. So it's really interesting to take something and to really kind of delve down deep into how it came to be, because this is a dish he never ate in Sri Lanka. He did not eat this growing up. He didn't eat it as a young adult. Like, you just need a base for the curry. You need the base. It's like a foundation. Once you have the foundation, whatever you put in will turn out great. So he starts, by talking about this foundation, and he recreates it, right? Like he's actually cooking for me as we're doing the interview. So recreate it. And I think in that way, it is a metaphor. It's a metaphor for the foundation of where he came from, what was important to him. It was my grandmother and her being in the kitchen and his memories of this, that it comes from somewhere, right? Even though he didn't cook or he wasn't procuring any of these ingredients or helping her in the kitchen, her cooking and her food were so important to him. So this foundation, I think, right, of like, the oils, the spices, the foundation is largely onion, garlic, and ginger, and the various different spices. And they vary from person to person or from family to family. And then I say, I don't remember eating mushroom curry. Where did you come up with this? Like, how did this become part of your everyday cooking? And then he talks about the fact that, when he went to England and he was a student, he was a starving, poor student, literally, and he was trying to cook. He had already had the foundation of cooking, right? Cooking a curry that he learned from being on his own in Sri Lanka as a teacher. And then when he gets to England, he misses meat curries. But he didn't have, like, he and a group of young men who were living together, who were all students and of all the same economic predicament. And so mushroom really came about because it was available, right? And I asked him, are you looking for specific kind? He said, no, whatever is available, right? Like, so it's the practicality of cooking too, right? Like it's just what's available, but it's also because it provided them with a very similar kind of texture as meat that they could not afford. And so he sort of perfected this, and then he didn't really cook it very much when he got to the States because his wife my aunt did a lot of the cooking. And then he's kind of come back to it in retirement as he's sort of like expanding what he's cooking and what he's doing. I think there are a few things about this is that one, the food sort of really parallels his growth and his understanding and his ways of remembering things in his life. But it's also about practicality that's also really important. We don't want to sort of like romanticize cooking in a way. Sometimes it's just people do things for practical reasons and it turns out in this beautiful way. It's also about constraints under which people operate at various points in their lives, especially in displacement. So I think there's a beautiful story to kind of think about there. It also is about his evolution as a cook, right? It's not for survival. It's not for longing. It's something that he has access to meat now, but he still cooks mushroom curry.
Yeah, super interesting.
And so that's also really interesting. I think that there's something that's really beautiful about delving down deep into one dish and letting it tell you the story of other things. He would say things like, I can't imagine how my mom did it. Right? Like, I can't imagine how she fed 9 children. And so it's almost like remembering the impossibility. He's able to say that now in his 70s because he himself can truly understand what it took for her to do what she did and how she was able to still feed them under really dire sort of circumstances. So there's this, like, I think we call it remembering impossibility, which isn't about like you're not saying it just to say it. You're saying that because you can actually truly relate to the impossibility of how structurally impossible it seems to you now in a way that you probably couldn't have gotten to that point. Not just food. He's not saying, oh, I can't believe, she fed 9 people on a daily basis and she was constantly in the kitchen and constantly figuring out how to make ends meet. but rather I think what he's also saying, he's thinking about the gender dynamics, thinking about her own life and what she gave up and what she had to put up with my grandfather, and how she cooked in a brick oven kind of thing, and how she spent pretty much most of her time in the kitchen because she didn't have modern sort of appliances, right? And so I think there's a genuine, deep understanding about the impossibility of that statement.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I do think that'll be a very interesting sort of theme or way to tell the story. I know you're also researching the history of roti in Washington, D.C. Can you tell us about that project?
Sure. So I have two colleagues that I work with, both anthropologists, both at American University where I work. We have this wonderful grant that we were awarded through the Humanities Truck Project. And a colleague of mine, Miriam Durrani, there are restaurants. And so like there are different ways to kind of like think through this and what restaurants are doing, whether roti is really popular or not. Oftentimes people think they know roti, but they're actually having other kinds of flatbread, right? And so what does that look like? What does it tell us about where restaurants are located in DC? What the movement of diaspora and gentrification has done in order to make it as a restaurant? How do you change menus? How are you catering to different communities in which you're located, et cetera? So those are some things, and the gendered nature of roti as well. So really thinking through that. One of the fun projects of this is that I lived overseas in Ethiopia for a long time. There is a very large Ethiopian and Eritrean diaspora in DC. And so a really fun thing about this project is that we're looking at a lot of the work that she's done in Roti through the Roti Collective, and really thinking about another sort of iconic flatbread, which is injera, and really thinking about some of the similarities and differences in how it travels, how it's sort of made to translate here, what some of those similar kinds of dynamics might be, and what are the differences between these groups. Particularly, roti isn't necessarily South Asian. It's also traveled to the Caribbean. Caribbean roti is huge. And so really thinking about these differences between these two really prominent and important diaspora communities and their love for flatbread. So it's a really fun project, and it's a really interesting project to really sort of think about. Again, it moves us away from the confines of an academic project and really thinking about making it really more publicly accessible, doing like roti making demonstrations, really thinking about the history of roti. So it's something that's really fun, I think.
So I was talking about the food historian Ken Albala, and he said something in our discussion that cooking is a form of communication, and whether you intend it or not, what you serve, what you eat is saying something about you. So in this project, in this family project, if you have to distill it down, and cooking is a form of communication, what is it saying?
In my family, Ashley, if you were to come over, my family would do a whole reconnaissance around what your food preferences are, right? And they would cater to you. Like, this is how I've always known things, right? You're a guest, and it's so important. Like, I grew up having to finish everything on my plate. I grew up never being, like, it's just really, you're a bad human being if you refuse food at someone else's house. I'm so sensitive to this. And so food is a sign of respect. It's a sign of honor. Like, that is, and many of us in my family, I'm not saying this is without, Sri Lankans in general, but we don't often communicate love, right? Like, I don't remember saying I love you or like affection. Food is it. It is really still the main way that we show affection and love and care. And I think for me, yes, this was a project that I wanted to kind of preserve certain things. But as I said, and like as I went through these, I feel like it was a different form of communication with my aunts and uncles in a very different kind of relationship. But I'm still their niece. I mean, I don't think that really changed, but it was just a form of communication in a way that they felt respected, that they were asked these questions, that it was my form of actually communicating my affection for so much that they did, to be in a space where we could continue this work of preserving language and culture and food. I absolutely think it is that. I think about this a lot, where I don't necessarily know if any of us really do this for our children, to show love in that way through cooking. And that is also something that I'm really trying to be much more mindful of, like cooking more for my children in the kinds of foods that they want, as to kind of recreate that too. Because I realize, coming from an immigrant family, people are really direct. They tell you things as the way they are. They don't sugarcoat things. But cooking is always the space of safety and love. And so that's really how I would say that many of my relatives actually show affection, is through cooking. The way you show respect and honor is, and love, is through cooking. I couldn't agree more. And I think I'm finally able to kind of like understand that more and more.
Well, I love Ina Garten. I've always loved her. And there's this quote, and I'm sure I'm not going to get it exactly right, but it's something like, I hope you know that when I invite you in my home, I'm telling you I love you. And I think like maybe it is a universal form of communication where food is love. And that's not always the case. It can signify power dynamics or other things too. But I think one of the most powerful is love, which is
absolutely
beautiful.
Absolutely. And I don't know if it's universal. I've been in situations where I have been in a home where I couldn't really eat anything on that table, right? And so it's really shocking to kind of grow up in this community and to be in a space where I didn't feel a sense of belonging. And these were like, these were with really close relationships where I didn't feel a sense of belonging. And I didn't realize it then, as a young adult. I didn't realize how much that meant to me, and how much food really is about inclusion and belonging, and a form of respect and affection that now I think I understand a lot better. So I do agree with you that absolutely I agree with Ina Garten too, but it's like, I don't know. I've certainly been in multiple situations where it was shocking. I don't know if I could have described it to you then the way that I'm describing it to you now, but it's for me, it's a huge shock when you walk into a space and no one has considered or thought about what you like or what you actually eat. Yeah.
Yeah. And a good tip for us going forward, like to be cognizant of that for those that we invite into our spaces. So you went into this project through a food lens. Did you get the migration stories you wanted?
Yes, absolutely. I learned a lot about my family. I learned about family dynamics. I learned about struggles, gender dynamics, how hard it was for my grandmother and my aunts and even my mom. I learned about just the sheer perseverance of how everyone got here and why they were, in my mind, growing up, like they were so hard on us. I understand some of those. I'm much more cognizant and forgiving of that sort of need to make sure that we fared better than they did, and just how much the family sort of has stuck it out regardless of where displacement took them. They've been in the US for longer than they've been in Sri Lanka or any other place. So this is home, and how they've recreated home. Like, this is the most astonishing thing to me, is like when I go home, there's an entire community. There's an entire Sri Lankan Tamil community that takes care of my parents as they're aging. Like, I don't know, last summer I spent the whole summer with them, and they had a couple of medical issues, and people were like, why is she taking you to the doctor? What does she know? And I'm like, I'm 50. To them, it's just like, I'm still a 15-year-old essentially, right? And so there's this immense sense of community that they have built over 40 some odd years, right? And that to me is incredible. And they are assimilated. They wouldn't fare well in Jaffna right now. None of them would. And so I think about this as I age. Like, what is my community? It's really different and it's really dispersed and it doesn't look the same way. And for whatever reason, they've been able to they're still living in the same kind of community and care context that I grew up in. And that to me is just remarkably so impressive.
So, as we explore in my brand, Amatand, which is French for to take care of your soul, objects can hold a lot of meaning for us. They can tie us to the past, enable us to be more present, or sometimes even take us into the future. Can you share an object from your life, whether you still have it or not, that holds a lot of meaning for you, and tell us why?
I have this necklace that my grandmother had made for me. It's sort of a traditional necklace that you wear with a sari. It's incredibly meaningful because I think she, alongside my dad, she is probably the person that I was closest to growing up. She raised me. And my grandmother didn't have a lot of money when she came here either. And when we think about inheritances, my grandmother actually gave us these objects before she passed, which I think is absolutely beautiful now that I think about it. It's not after they passed, but it was something that I actually wore when she was there. So it's something that I really treasure. I wear it when I have a special event, for instance, a traditional event like a wedding or something to go to. So it's something that is really meaningful to me and I still have. And I don't have daughters, but I don't know what I will do with it. But it's just something that is really meaningful to me.
That's amazing. Well, you've probably heard of this practice called Swedish death cleaning, which is of giving these things away before you die, well before you die. And this sounds very similar, and it's such a beautiful practice. Can you share a favorite tradition? It could be something that you did when you were a kid, something you do with your kids, anything at all.
So, as a kid, like I said, many of us didn't have a lot of outside friends because we had a whole gaggle of cousins. I mean, who wouldn't when your mom has 8 siblings and we all kind of grew up in the same space. We actually celebrated Christmas in Sri Lanka. I remember that because there are lots of Tamil Christians, including some of my extended family members. So both American holidays, right? And then also some of our traditional holidays were always spent with family. And that I think is really meaningful to me. Sometimes it gets recreated, especially when my children were younger. But now we have a tradition where we actually go away for the holidays. We go to a different country. And I have 2 teenage boys that get really angry over this because they're just it's supposed to snow in the winter. And you take us to places where it does not snow. But I like to go away and I like to see how other people celebrate holidays. It's just more and more recently where my kids have been pushing back, wanting to stick pretty close to having a Christmas tree or having presents. And I was just I don't know. I don't know if it's a rebellion or if it's a different sort of thing that I'm trying to do. I'm still pondering this.
Well, it's an interesting one. I know some people have started doing this for the holidays, and I think I'm sure there's a reason, and you will find it. And you'll be able to communicate it to them. Are you in a phase in your life where you enjoy entertaining in your home? Why or why not?
So I am, it's really interesting. We moved around quite a bit as my parents' economic circumstances improved as a child. We moved houses quite a bit. My parents entertain a lot. A lot of my family does. They still do. Their social network in life is so much more extensive than mine. It's something that I have always enjoyed and liked, but I also find myself moving around quite a bit. I have done it when we were overseas because the expat community is very small and insular, so that it's just something that we do. But here, I would really like to do this. I was actually thinking about doing some sort of a dinner club. It's just something that I think would be really a wonderful way of reconnecting, coming back to the US after a number of years abroad. And more time I spend with my parents, I realize how important food is to my life, and to be able to like share that with other people, I think would be wonderful.
Amazing. Do you have one or two top resources? It could be books or websites or podcasts. It doesn't have to be associated with either anthropology or epidemiology or food. Sometimes people just give us their favorite books. People who listen love to read, as I do. So it could just be a few of your favorites.
I read for a living, but I have really tried to embrace reading for joy. And I've been reading quite a bit in the last couple of years, especially because of a lot of uncertainty with where I was abroad and then coming back and et cetera. This has been a really stressful period of my life. And so reading for pleasure, I think, is like a form of self-care. And so I've done it quite a bit. The book that I think really sticks out in my mind is Crying in H Mart. It's based on the author. It's sort of part memoir, part cooking book. It's beautiful. It's really beautiful and funny and sad. And she's biracial. Her dad's white. Her mom is Asian. And it's this beautiful sort of tribute to her mom. And the only other thing that I'm really proud about, I think I'm so excited about, is that I have a lab. It's not a traditional lab in a sense, like it's called the Public Ethnography Lab. And it's really about not so much anthropology, it's really focused on the method of ethnography, really sort of doing community engaged work that really is about fine tuning, being a good listener, really sort of having intellectual curiosity about others. A lot of people do this, but they don't call it ethnography. And it's really about sort of moving research. You could do research and it does not have to be something that you're formally trained in. You don't have to have a PhD. You don't even have to be in the academy to do it. It's really to kind of like, at this moment in the age of AI and big data, to really sort of continue to focus on people and their stories.
And where can people find that?
So it's publicethnography.lab.com. We have a website. We have a few things going on, and we're really hoping to do more methods, training.
Amazing. Last question. You maybe answered this with the reading, but what do you do for yourself? Do you have a practice, a focus, a habit, or daily routine that contributes to your success and or your well-being?
Okay, I'm totally a type A personality, so even my form of self-care is a little bit obsessive. I did a lot of art growing up and in college, and then as with many things in life, all the things that bring you joy sort of like go out the window as you're focused on your career. So I've returned to art, painting, ceramics. So right now I'm kind of in the ceramics phase of my self-care routine. And it's wonderful because I still try to kind of chase this perfectionist thing, but the wheel has its own mind. You don't want to fight the wheel. It's the wrong thing to do. So art is lovely. I do a lot of forms of physical exercise. So I spend a lot of time in that. My recent obsession, so I do chai tea, yoga, I do weightlifting. My most recent obsession is boxing. And it brings me so much joy. And it's actually really good for me. And it helps me to really focus and to get out a lot of my energy on the bag, or definitely not other people yet, but on the bag.
Amazing. Well, Thurka, thank you so much for spending time with me. It's been such a pleasure talking about your family project, about your profession. There's just so much for us to learn through this project and then also through the resources that you've given us. So I really appreciate you, and it's been really a pleasure.
Thank you so much. This was so much fun.
On the Table with Ashley is presented by Amatond, an elevated, everyday, luxury home and tableware brand with products designed to cultivate connection. You can learn more about Amatond at ameatendre.com or on Instagram at Amatond. By subscribing to our newsletter on the Amatond website, you'll receive updates on new episodes as well as promotions relating to Amatond and Amatond's products. Send us an email at reachoutanytime@amatond.com if you have ideas for guests or series ideas you'd like to pass along. Thanks for listening.